An old road winds through the hills of Logan County, West Virginia. Cracked asphalt gives way to gravel, and gravel gives way to dirt. And just beyond the bend, where two tired oaks lean in close like they're whispering secrets, there's a clearing no one dares speak of anymore. It's there where this tale begins, in a place locals once called Widow's Hollow. And what happened there? Well, let's just say it still lingers like the mist that clings to the valley every morning come October. Our story begins in the spring of 1910. That was the year folks still hitched horses outside the general store, and the coal dust hadn't quite choked out the bluegrass. A time when the world was slower, harder, and the people living in these hollers, well, they knew how to keep a secret. That's when Grace Holloway was born. Grace was the third child of Jeb and Clara Holloway. Her birth wasn't marked by much fanfare, just the screech of a barn owl and the thump of rain on a tin roof. Her mama delivered her in the back bedroom of a drafty farmhouse, and her daddy didn't say much, just lit his pipe and thanked the good Lord it wasn't another boy to fight the mines. Now, Grace was different from the very beginning, pale as creek foam and quiet as dusk. Folks said she had an old soul, always staring off at nothing, always whispering the things no one else could see. Her grandmother, Mabel, said it plain, that child was born with a veil. See, back then, folks believed some babies came into this world with a thin membrane over their face, a call marking them as seers, watchers, maybe even walkers between worlds. As Grace grew, strange things happened. Animals followed her. Dogs wouldn't bark when she came near. Cats watched her with the kind of knowing look that made even grown men uneasy. And she'd speak of things before they happened, like when her uncle's mule threw a shoe 3 counties away, and Grace declared it at supper that very night. By the age of 9, Grace was spending most of her days near the old cemetery past Widow's Hollow. She'd wander between the moss-covered stones like she was visiting friends. Sometimes she even left flowers, wild columbine, black-eyed Susans, little bundles of mountain laurel. And when asked who the flowers were for, she'd smile and say, the ones who still listen. Now, you can imagine how a girl like that was treated in a town like Elkhorn Ridge. Church-going folks don't take kindly to oddities, especially ones that talk to things they can't see. Still, her mama swore Grace had a gift. God don't make mistakes, Clara told anyone who'd listen. He just gives some of us harder roads to walk. But Grace wasn't the only one who felt the weight of something strange. You see, that year, the year she turned 10, was when the trouble started. First came the crows. Hundreds of maybe thousands. They filled the sky like a plague, darkening the noon sun. They perched on rooftops, fences, and power lines. One morning, the schoolhouse was so covered in birds that class had to be canceled. The preacher said it was a sign. The farmers said it was nature. But Grace, she just watched. Then the dream started. Clara was the first to wake up screaming. Said she'd seen her mother, dead 20 years, standing at the foot of her bed, mouth full of dirt and eyes weeping blood. Days later, her youngest son Jacob woke up crying, claiming there's a man in the well and he knows my name. It was just after the third family on Widow's Hollow packed up and left in the dead of night that folks realized something wasn't right. But Grace, she seemed calm, like she'd been waiting on it. Then came the cellar door. One morning, Jeb Holloway went out to the root cellar to fetch onions for stew. The family heard him scream. When they ran outside, they found him halfway down the hill, covered in mud, shaking like a leaf. All he could say was, "It opened. Lord help me, it opened on its own." Now, the Holloway root cellar was built solid. Stone walls, thick timber door with iron hinges. There hadn't been wind that morning. No sign of animals. But something had opened that door, and Jeb refused to speak another word about it. That very night, Grace told her mama, "It's time." The ground's remembering again. No one knew what she meant. Not then, anyway. That's when Clara began to dig. Now, Clara Holloway wasn't one for nonsense. She was stern, God-fearing, and didn't believe in ghost stories. But something about that cellar shook her to her core. She took up her late father's spade and started digging behind the house near the edge of the tree-line. Every day for weeks, she dug. And every night, Grace would stand by the window, staring at the moon, whispering to someone only she could see. Neighbors talked. Sure, said the Holloways had finally gone mad, said Grace was cursed. But the truth? It was buried deeper than anyone dared to believe. Then came the scream. It was the night of July 3rd, 1920. Fireflies blinked over the cornfields, and the scent of honeysuckle hung heavy in the air. The town was quiet, save for the crickets and the hum of summer. Then, just past midnight, a scream ripped through the hollow. High, long, and full of such agony that it twisted the blood in your veins. It came from the Holloway farm. By the time neighbors arrived, the house was empty. The front door swung on its hinges. The cellar was open, the earth around it freshly disturbed. And the only thing left behind was a muddy doll sitting upright on the front porch, its eyes scratched clean off. Grace, Clara, and Jeb were gone, vanished, without a trace. No blood, no footprints, just a silence that sat too thick for comfort. And so the legend of Widow's Hollow was born. But my friend, this story, like the forest, has roots that run deeper still. And what happens next? Well, you'll want to leave a light on for that part. The Holloway place stood empty for nearly 20 years after that night. Grass grew tall through the front steps. Vines swallowed the walls. The orchard withered, and the roof sagged beneath the weight of every forgotten season. Folks said the land had been touched, that it was cursed, that whatever happened that night was best left alone. But the thing about stories in Appalachia, they don't stay buried long. And neither do the dead. By 1938, most folks had learned to avoid the long dirt path leading into Widow's Hollow. Hunters didn't go that far. Children were warned to stay away. And for a time, it seemed like the valley itself had decided to forget, until a girl named Elsie Carter wandered in. Now, Elsie was a different kind of soul, born with red hair and a streak of defiance. She was the only daughter of a coal miner and a piano teacher. She grew up just 3 miles from Widow's Hollow in a creaky white farmhouse with more chickens than furniture. But it wasn't the chickens that set her apart. It was the way she dreamed. Elsie had night terrors from the time she could walk. Her mother said she'd sit straight up in bed and mutter things no child should know. Names of long-dead relatives. Descriptions of places she'd never seen. Once, she screamed that the ground was crying, and when her parents rushed into her room, they found her shivering, curled at the foot of the bed with dirt under her fingernails. She was 5. Now, the Carters did what mountain families always do when faced with the strange. They prayed. They burned sage. They buried a lock of her hair under the porch to ward off the spirits. But the dreams kept coming. Then, one day in the fall of 1938, Elsie went missing. She'd been sent to gather wildflowers for the church altar. It was nearly dark when her father realized she hadn't returned. The whole town turned out to search for her. They combed the woods with lanterns and dogs, calling her name until their voices gave out. It wasn't until the next morning that they found her. She was sitting cross-legged at the base of the Holloway cellar, eyes wide, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her dress was spotless. Her shoes were missing. And in her lap lay a single doll, porcelain face, cracked across the cheek, with 2 small black stones where the eyes should have been. "Who gave you that doll, baby?" Her mama whispered, falling to her knees. Elsie just smiled and said, "The lady in white." Now, you can imagine what kind of stir that caused. The sheriff came and looked the place over. Said there was no sign of anyone, no footprints, but Elsie's. They roped off the property, posted a warning sign. But deep down, they knew it wouldn't help. You can't keep people out of places they're drawn to. And some people, well, they're born drawn. For months after that, Elsie changed. She stopped sleeping through the night. She stopped eating much. She started spending hours sitting alone in the yard, speaking to someone who wasn't there. And when her mother pressed her, she finally whispered, "She's sad. She misses her little boy." That's when the headaches started. Terrible ones. Like someone was hammering from the inside out. The town doctor, old Doc Parsons, couldn't make sense of them. Said maybe she had female nerves. Gave her laudanum drops and told her mama to keep her calm. But nothing stopped the visions. She began to draw strange symbols. Circles with arrows pointing inward. shapes of the Holloway house with dark smudges hanging over it like clouds. Once, she even scribbled a picture of the old cellar door wide open, with hands, pale, gnarled hands, crawling up from the ground. Folks whispered that Elsie was cursed. Some even said the Holloway girl had returned through her. Now, most of the town tried to ignore it, but there was one man who couldn't. Walter Harlan was a local gravedigger, tall, hunched, and older than the coal hills. Said little, smoked too much, but he knew stories. Stories from his grandfather about the Holloway land long before Jeb and Clara ever laid eyes on it. And one day, he showed up on the Carter's porch with an old map and a shaking hand. "This here," he said, pointing at the edge of the Holloway orchard. "This land wasn't always dry. There used to be a well, deepest one in the county, but the preacher had it sealed after what they found inside." Elsie, sitting nearby, suddenly spoke. "He drowned 'cause his mama was afraid." The gravedigger froze. "Who drowned?" her father asked, but Elsie didn't answer. She just stared at the floorboards. A few days later, the old man was found dead in his shack, eyes wide open, map clutched in his hand. Heart attack, they said, but those who saw his face swore it looked like something scared the life clean out of him. Still, the Carter family stayed quiet, until the dreams took a turn. One night, Elsie screamed so loud the neighbors came running. Her mother found her thrashing in bed, crying out for someone named Thomas. She kept saying, "He's in the dark. He's still there. His fingers are cold. Mama, please help him." Her mother wrapped her in quilts and whispered prayers. But that night was different, because just before dawn, Elsie woke up and calmly said, "He showed me where he is." That morning, she led her father deep into Widow's Hollow, past the cellar, past the crumbled barn, all the way to the apple tree that once stood beside the house. There, beneath its twisted roots, she pointed to the ground. "Dig," she said. "He's cold." Her father hesitated, then fell to his knees with a shovel. 3 feet down, he hit wood, a child's coffin, weathered, cracked, nailed shut with rusted iron tacks. They pulled it up and took it into town. The sheriff, the doctor, and the preacher came. They opened the box. Inside was the skeletal remains of a boy no older than 5, wrapped in a faded blanket, holding a broken rattle. There was no name, no burial record, no explanation, but every old-timer knew. It was a Holloway baby, the stillborn son Mary Lee had died giving birth to. Only he wasn't stillborn. Elsie never spoke of it again. The dream stopped, the drawing ceased, the doll was burned, and the Carter family quietly packed up and moved to Missouri. But the cellar? It's still there, covered in leaves, swallowed by time. And some say that if you stand over it on a moonless night, you can still hear her. The lullaby, soft broken, just like her, Mary Lee, waiting. For a time, the story of the Holloway boy was the only thing folks in Elkhorn Ridge could talk about. It made the local paper. Just a few lines buried on page 4. Remains of child found on abandoned farm. Authorities investigating. They didn't mention the name, didn't mention the cellar, certainly didn't mention the dreams of a little girl named Elsie Carter. But the old ones, they knew what it meant. Something had been uncovered, something the land had worked very hard to forget. And just like that, the Holloway farm, forgotten for decades, was no longer just a ruin in the woods. It became a place of whispered warnings. Some wanted it consecrated. Others said it needed to be burned. But one man saw an opportunity. Enter Harold Finch. Now Harold wasn't from Elkhorn Ridge. He was what folks around here call an outsider. Born and raised in Charleston, made his money in salvage and real estate. Came through town in the spring of 1941, driving a shiny black Oldsmobile with a slick-back grin and a handshake that lingered a little too long. He'd heard about the Holloway place through a distant cousin who worked in the county records office. And Harold? He didn't believe in ghosts. What he did believe in was land, timber, stone, and buried value. He bought the Holloway acres for next to nothing, a cursed deal, the old sheriff called it, and set out to tear down what was left. But here's the thing about digging up old bones in the mountains. You're never quite sure what else you'll wake up. The first week of the demolition started quiet enough. Harold brought in a few local men to help. Out-of-work farmhands willing to swing hammers in exchange for a hot meal and a few dollars. They cleared out the barn first, then began cutting through the collapsed cabin with axes and saws. That's when things started getting strange. Tools went missing. Equipment refused to start. One of the workmen, a boy named Sammy Rourke, claimed he heard a woman humming beneath the floorboards as he pried up the last of the kitchen planks. "Sounded like a lullaby," he muttered, white as chalk, soft and sad like she ain't never stopped waiting. They laughed him off, of course, called him superstitious, told him to keep swinging. But on the fourth day, Harold unearthed the root cellar, covered in years of vines and ash. It looked like just another depression in the ground. But when he cleared the brush and pried open the old wooden hatch, the air that came out was cold. Too cold. The kind of cold that didn't belong to spring. They found the original steps beneath the dirt. Stone, worn smooth from years of use. Harold, being Harold, marched right down, lantern in hand. Said he wanted to see what all the fuss was about. He was down there a long time. And when he came back up, he didn't say a word. Not that day. Not the next. But the very night after the cellar was opened, the knocking started. The men slept in a shack nearby. Harold had set it up as temporary housing. Around 2 a.m., they were woken by what sounded like someone rapping on the walls. 3 knocks, always in sets of 3. At first, they thought it was the wind. But the knocking kept getting closer. First the walls, then the floor, then the beds. One man, Clyde Minton, ran screaming into the woods in nothing but his long johns. Said a gray hand reached out from the floorboards and touched his ankle. He never came back. And Harold? He still wouldn't speak about what he saw in that cellar. Instead, he started drinking. Hard. By the end of the week, the remaining crew had quit, and Harold was alone on the land. Locals say they'd see him wander in the woods, muttering under his breath. Sometimes he'd be kneeling at the edge of the foundation, digging with his bare hands. One night, the town constable caught him standing in the orchard, soaked with rain, holding a rusted child's shoe. He didn't say where he'd found it, just stared past the trees and whispered, "She's looking for him." Still, the town tried to help, tried to intervene, but Harold was beyond reach. Then came the fire. July 5th, 1941. Same date the Holloways vanished. 21 years to the day. The woods lit up in a blaze that could be seen from 4 counties away. Flames reached so high they licked the stars. The fire consumed the shack, the tools, the remaining beams of the Holloway cabin. When firefighters arrived the next morning, everything was ash. Everything except the cellar. Untouched, not even singed. They never found Harold's body. No bones. No teeth, just his watch, still ticking, half buried at the cellar's mouth. After that, the land was declared condemned. No one bought it, no one walked it, and the forest slowly crept back in, like a mother shielding a wounded child. But here's where things get even stranger. Because in 1962, 2 college boys from Marshall University decided to do a thesis on Appalachian ghost stories. They'd heard the legend of Widow's Hollow, and thought it'd make a good chapter in their book. They never made it back. Their car was found parked at the end of the old dirt road. Doors locked. Gas tank full. Inside the glove box was a notebook. The final entry read, "We made it to the old orchard. The cellar is still there. I swear I heard someone singing. We're going in." That was it. No sign of struggle. No bodies. No footprints. Just a notebook and a doll. Same porcelain face. Same black stone eyes. Wrapped in a sheet of old newspaper dated July 3rd, 1920. Elsie Carter, now married and living in Kansas, refused to speak to reporters when contacted about the find. Only thing she said, she told them not to go in. Some doors once opened don't ever close. To this day, Widow's Hollow remains abandoned. Locals call it the place where time forgets. Birds don't nest there. Deer don't graze. and even the wind seems to go silent when you cross its edge. But if you're foolish enough to visit and brave enough to stand at the cellar's mouth on the anniversary of the fire, they say you can hear them still. The knocks, the lullaby, the faint sound of footsteps climbing up from below. There's an old saying around these parts: if a story won't die, it means it ain't done. And if that's true, then the tale of Grace Holloway still had a long road ahead. By 1923, most folks in Elkhorn Ridge had stopped talking about the Holloways altogether. The house up on Widow's Hollow sat empty, windows boarded up, roof half sunk, like it was trying to forget what it saw. But forgetting's not easy in the mountains. The land remembers, and sometimes it answers. That summer, a young boy showed up in town. No one knew where he came from. He was maybe 9, barefoot, with mud on his ankles and a handmade satchel slung over one shoulder. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice was soft and strange, like it had never learned to echo right. His name, he said, was Jonah. Sheriff Alden picked him up near the outskirts of town, walking the ridge road just before dusk. The boy wouldn't say where his people were or how he'd gotten there, just said he was sent back and that he needed to find the girl in a yellow dress. Now, no one had worn a yellow dress in these parts since Grace Holloway. Claire used to sew them herself. Said yellow was the only color that didn't turn a shadow on that child. And just like that, a name long buried came crawling back to surface. Miss Weller, the schoolteacher, took Jonah in. She was a kind woman, too old for children of her own and too stubborn to let a child wander off into the hills alone. She gave him a bed, a warm plate, and tried her best not to ask too many questions. But things started to happen again. Birds flying in circles overhead for hours, apples rotting on the tree before harvest, and always Jonah watching, his eyes fixed on places no one else could see. One morning, Miss Weller found a drawing tucked into Jonah's notebook. It was done in charcoal, shaky lines, dark corners, but clear enough to see what it was. A house, half sunken, window boards missing, and something standing behind it. Not someone, something. A figure with no face, no hands. Just a shape darker than shadow and taller than any man. Miss Weller said nothing at first. She just folded the drawing and slid it back into his desk. But that night, she didn't sleep. And the next morning, Jonah was gone. Vanished. Again. Only this time, there were prints. Tiny bare footprints. Tracked to the garden mud, leading straight out the back door and off toward the ridge. Not a single one returning. Sheriff Alden led a search party into the woods. 3 dozen men with lanterns and rifles, calling the boy's name. They found nothing for hours, until they reached the boundary line of Widow's Hollow. That's where they found the scarecrow. It had been there for years, tattered coat, sackcloth face, leaning on a pole in the middle of the fallow cornfield beside the Holloway house. Only now it had something new. In its lap sat a charcoal drawing. The same house, the same shadow figure. But this time, the girl in the yellow dress was there too. She stood in the doorway, smiling, and beside her, Jonah. Sheriff Alden kept the drawing locked in his desk until the day he died. Said it weren't something to be shown around. That paper, he said, burned your hands just a touch. Years passed. Folks moved on. But the land didn't. Every so often, someone would see the scarecrow turn its head, just a twitch, like it was watching you back. Others said they saw a girl near the tree line, pale, still, holding something in her hands. Once, a hunter swore he followed a barefoot child for nearly 2 miles through snow, only to watch the tracks vanish at the old well by the Holloway house. By 1947, the land was bought up by a logging company out of Pittsburgh. They sent a crew to clear the ridge and prep the basin for road expansion. On the 3rd day, a worker named Ellis Cantrell was cutting down a tulip poplar when a saw struck something below the bark. It wasn't rock. It was bone. The trunk split open like it had grown around it. Inside were 3 human ribs and a piece of fabric, yellow, brittle as old paper. Ellis dropped the saw and ran. When they dug around the base of the tree, they found more vertebrae, small finger bones, and a silver button the shape of a crescent moon. Same kind Clara Holloway used to sew into Grace's collars. The project was halted, the company pulled out, and Widow's Hollow was left to rot, untouched once more. But Ellis, he didn't fare well. He started talking to himself, said he could still hear the saw blade screaming, that it wasn't the bone that screamed, it was the girl. He hung himself 3 months later, left a note nailed to the door of his tool shed. I saw her eyes inside the wood. She ain't gone. She's still waiting on the boy. Some folks believe Jonah was never a boy at all, that he was something else, something sent to bring Grace back, or worse, to lead others into whatever place she'd gone. Others say Grace never left. They say she's still there, beneath the earth, beneath the roots and stone, whispering to the hollow each time the wind shifts wrong. And every now and then, when the air gets still and the birds go silent, you might see 2 shapes near the tree line, one small, barefoot, and the other in a yellow dress, fading in and out like a firefly before rain. But don't follow. No matter what you hear, no matter who calls your name, don't follow, because the Holloway girl doesn't want to be found. She wants to remember, and some memories should stay buried. Some stories claw their way back, no matter how deep you bury them. By the time 1951 rolled around, most of the old names were gone. Sheriff Alden passed in his sleep. Miss Weller had a stroke and died with her Bible open to Ezekiel. Even the Holloway land had grown thick again, trees swallowing the ruins like a body pulling skin over a wound. But there were still a few who remembered. Old Man Tipton was one of them, born in Elkhorn Ridge back in 1879. Worked the salt mine from the time he was 16 till they shuttered it during the Depression. He didn't speak much in his final years, but when he did, it always circled back to them bones in the deep shaft. See, back before the Holloways went missing, back before Grace ever walked this earth, there was another story, one that stayed in whispers, traded in low voices over lanterns and jars of blackstrap. In 1904, a section of the Ridgeview salt mine collapsed. 3 men were trapped below, Jeb Barker, Horace Day, and Levi Nash. They were good men, family men. They say you could hear them calling out for 2 days before the earth finally swallowed the air. The company sealed it off. Too dangerous to dig, too costly to fix. But Tipton, he said he saw something down there. Said they sent him in with the rescue crew after the first blast. What he remembered wasn't the cave-in, wasn't the fire or the screaming. It was the silence, how deep it ran, like the rock itself was listening. When they reached the lower tunnels, there weren't any bodies, just a set of footprints. Bare, child-sized, leading deeper. Tipton told the foreman, but they laughed him off, said it was the gas talking. Only thing was, Tipton never went back in that mine. Retired early. Started sleeping with a shotgun next to his bed and salt around the doors. Years later, folks forgot, as they do, but the mountain didn't. In '55, a group of geology students from Kentucky State came to Elkhorn. They wanted to map the abandoned shafts, study the mineral deposits. They were young, bright-eyed, thought themselves braver than most. 4 of them went down. Only 3 came back. The 4th, a boy named Lane O'Connor, vanished somewhere past Shaft 7. No cave-in, no animal tracks. Just gone. When the other students were questioned, they said they heard something strange in the tunnels. Not an echo, not water, a voice, singing. A girl's voice, soft and slow, humming a tune no one could place. They followed it, thinking it was radio interference or some strange resonance. Lane walked ahead of the group, turned the corner, and never came out the other side. They called for hours. One swore she saw a yellow light flicker in the dark, like a lantern swinging. Another said he heard laughter. But Lane O'Connor was never seen again. After that, the Ridgeview mine was sealed permanently. Concrete and steel plates bolted into the mountain. You won't find it on any current maps. But locals still know where it is. And they don't go near it, not even during hunting season. Now here's where it twists like a copperhead. In 1972, a man named Reverend Caldwell arrived in Elkhorn. Said he'd had visions. Dreams of a girl in a yellow dress standing in the middle of a dry riverbed, her mouth full of dirt and her eyes rolled white. Said the Lord told him to build a church near the ridge, close to the seal mine. Folks were skeptical at first, but the Reverend had a way about him. He didn't shout or wave fire. He whispered, said things that sounded like remember and repent, and they're not through yet. He bought a parcel of land 2 miles east of Widow's Hollow and laid the first stone himself, called it the House of Renewal. But here's what no one knew until later. Caldwell wasn't a real reverend. He'd been defrocked in '64 for preaching spiritual corruption of the flesh and performing rituals not recognized by any church, living or dead. One night in '73, 2 hikers from upstate were passing through when they stumbled across the church. They said they saw something through the broken windows, a woman in a yellow dress kneeling before the altar, only she had no face, just skin stretched smooth where the features should have been, and behind her, standing in the shadows, someone much taller, or something. The hikers ran straight to the sheriff in the next town. When the law showed up the next day, the church was empty. No Reverend Caldwell, no woman, just a smell, wet stone and decay, and a book left open on the pulpit. Not a Bible, something older, with pages of pressed skin and ink that shimmered when you tilted it against the light. They burned the church to the ground, salted the earth, said prayers in every tongue they could find. But the ridge, it's never been right since. Animals won't cross it. Trees grow sideways. And every so often, someone still hears humming when the wind blows through pines. The kind of song that sounds like it remembers you. You live long enough out here, you start to feel the land breathe. The ridge has a pulse. And if you listen hard enough at night, it'll talk back. But not in words, in remembrance. See, the truth about Widow's Hollow, the part even the old preachers never dared touch, goes further back than the Holloways, further than the mine, further even than the first white men to set foot here with their muskets and Bibles. It goes back to the ones who never left. The Cherokee once called this place where the earth speaks. The hollow wasn't always hollow. It used to be a deep grove, thick with red maples and ironwood trees, a place avoided by even the medicine men. They said the soil there was too soft, like it breathed, said strange lights moved through the trees at dusk, and that sometimes the deer came out walking wrong, like their bones had been rearranged. One story, passed down in broken tongue, tells of a woman who wandered into the grove during a red moon. She was heavy with child, alone, crying, and something answered her. When she came out 3 days later, she was no longer weeping, but her shadow walked opposite her, and the baby inside her kicked only when the wind blew from the east. That same woman founded a bloodline, one that mixed with settlers, one that eventually gave rise to the Holloways, and perhaps to Grace herself. Now, you might think that's just folklore, but let me tell you something chilling. In 1937, a traveling anthropologist named Walter Keene came through Elkhorn, writing a book on forgotten mountain religions. He stopped in a town store, asked if anyone knew of the mourning women of the Hollow. The clerk turned pale and told him to go back the way he came. Keene didn't listen. He found Widow's Hollow, set up camp there for 3 nights, kept detailed notes. Only 2 pages of that journal survived, found stuffed in a hollow tree a mile from where his burnt tent was discovered. His body was never found. Here's what those 2 pages said, written in scratchy rush script. There's no bottom to this place. You dig and dig, and it only grows darker. I found the stone they spoke of. It is not carved. It grew here, like a tooth, like something gnawed its way out, and the air around it smells like rust and flowers. Last night, I heard the crying again, but this time it was under me, like the roots were weeping. They were never worshiping something. They were feeding it. Now you tell me if that sounds like a man inventing stories. But it's what came next that chilled me most when I first heard it as a boy from my Aunt Maybelle, who was 84 and blind in both eyes, but swore she could see in her dreams. She said there were 2 kinds of folk in the hollow, those who came by choice and those who were called. Grace, she said, wasn't born like other children. Her mother, Eleanor Holloway, carried her for 11 months. When the midwife finally pulled Grace into the world, she didn't cry. She laughed, said it was the oddest sound. Not a baby's giggle, but something old, dry, like a well with wind blowing through it. And from the moment she could walk, Grace wandered. She'd vanish for hours at a time, then come back with muddy feet and pockets full of things no one could explain. Dried poppy husks, tiny woven dolls made from hair, bones tied together with river weed. Once, she brought back a tooth, long and yellowed, still warm. They had it tested in Charleston in '39. The professor said it belonged to no known animal. Eleanor tried to keep her inside, nailed the windows shut, barred the cellar, but nothing worked. Grace always found a way out, and she always came back with something new. It was around this time that townsfolk started whispering about the black hour near Widow's Hollow, right around 3:13 a.m., when even the insects went quiet. People claimed they saw lanterns floating through the trees, heard the same lullaby, soft and slurring, sung in a language no one could place. Dogs would whimper, cows would stop giving milk, and the babies born that month all had a veil over their faces. They called it the waking. See, Maybelle believed the hollow wasn't cursed. It was a threshold, a thin place between the flesh and something older. She said Grace wasn't a monster, wasn't a ghost. She was an answer to a prayer someone should never have said. It was a pact, she believed, made generations ago beneath that grove, where the woman cried out and the ground opened up to meet her grief. And like all pacts, it needed renewing every few decades. When the wrong bloodline thinned, when the mountain grew restless, the hollow called one back. And this time it called Grace. I'll never forget that night. Not because of what I saw, though Lord knows I saw enough to never sleep sound again, but because of what I felt. You can lie to yourself about what your eyes show you, but not about what your bones whisper when the land turns mean. It was August of 1942 when Grace disappeared for the last time. The war was still burning overseas, but around these hills, folks were fighting a battle much older than politics or borders. That summer had been strange from the start. Rain came and went in unnatural bursts. Frogs croaked louder than they had any right to. And there were birds, thousands of them, circling above Widow's Hollow every sunset like they was waiting for something to crawl up out of the trees. Animals were born twisted. Hounds wouldn't go near the creek. And more than one man reported dreams. The same dream, over and over. A woman standing in the woods, face hidden beneath a veil made of bark and hair, hands outstretched, bleeding. One man, Jed Turlow, said she whispered his name in Cherokee, though he'd never spoken a lick of it in his life. Woke up screaming, nose bleeding. Said she told him, it's time to return what was promised. Grace, by then, had become something like a shadow myth. No one seen her in nearly a year, though her house still stood on the edge of the hollow, windows dark, front porch collapsing like the forest was reclaiming it. But things kept happening. Children said they saw her at night, barefoot, standing in cornfields, hair tangled with twigs, face gray as ash, always humming. The preacher called it mass hysteria, said fear spreads like mold when left in a dark place too long. But it wasn't just fear, it was remembrance. See, the old bloodlines, those that went back to the pact, were thinning. The Holloways had no heirs left. Grace was the end of their line. But the mountain doesn't let things end naturally. It corrects, demands balance. And if the ones who owed the debt couldn't pay it, someone else would. So on the night of August 12th, the town decided they were going to finish it. A small group of men, miners, preachers, even one old bootlegger named Clyde, headed into the hollow with torches and rope, called themselves the Watchers, said they weren't scared of a girl, said they were going to burn the pact clean. I watched from the ridge, couldn't stop shaking, because I knew they weren't just going after a girl. They were going after something the land itself had adopted. They never made it past the clearing. Clyde's son, Tommy, was the only one who came back, half naked, eyes rolled so far back he could barely see white. He never spoke again, just mumbled to himself, drew circles on the asylum walls until the day he died. The others were found 3 days later, if you can call it found. What was left of them hung in the trees like meat sacks, their limbs bent at impossible angles, skin peeled back and long, ritual-looking strips. No animal could have done that. And at the center of the clearing, where the roots grow thickest, the earth had opened, not caved in, open like a mouth mid-scream. And carved into the dirt in perfect Cherokee symbols were 3 words: "The debt remains." After that night, Widow's Hollow was sealed. The sheriff had the area fenced, declared it a hazardous zone due to unstable terrain. Folks were warned off. Some moved. Some just stopped talking about it altogether, like forgetting it would make it untrue. But the air never forgot, and neither did the trees. I went back once, 40 years later, out of some foolish need to see it with my own eyes. I didn't go far, just to the edge of the old Holloway place. The house was gone, rotted into the earth, but the wind carried something that stopped me cold. A laugh, soft, dry, familiar, and then silence, except for one small thing, barely noticeable unless you were raised out here. The cicadas had stopped. Some folks say the hollow sleeps now. The forest's overgrown. The trails have vanished beneath moss and root. And most who live round these parts barely remember what happened. New families came. Old names died out. The past, like a wound left untended, scabbed over. But some of us remember. Not because we want to, because we have to. I live about 12 miles from where the hollow begins. My granddaddy built this cabin himself after the war. Said he wanted to be close to where it all turned. Back then I thought he meant the creek or the timber trade. But now I think he meant the veil. That invisible line where the world we know rubs up against something else. I don't go near the old boundary anymore. Not since 1986, when the Higgins boy vanished. His mama said he sleepwalked out of the house and never came back. All they found were his socks, folded neatly on the riverbank like he'd peeled out of the mid-step. But I still feel her. Sometimes I wake up to the sound of humming, low and distant, like it's coming from beneath the floorboards. Sometimes the wind carries something sharp, burnt sage, old blood, river silt. And some nights I'll see her, not fully, just a suggestion of her, a figure at the treeline, watching, never moving, long hair that hangs like seaweed, eyes like hollow pits. My dogs don't bark when she comes. They whimper. They hide. Folks ask me why I stay. I tell them this place ain't cursed. It's owed. Every generation. Someone has to remember, has to bear witness. That's how you keep things from waking up angry. So I write. I record. I pass the story on. Because I believe stories can bind what would otherwise break loose. Now, maybe you think this was just an old mountain yarn. Maybe you're city folk and think we're superstitious. That's fine, but let me ask you something. Have you ever stood in a forest so still you couldn't hear your own heartbeat? Ever looked into the dark and felt it looking back? Because if you have, then you already know. Some places don't forget. They wait. If this tale made the hair on your arms stand up or reminded you of your own family's ghost stories, go ahead and subscribe to hear more Appalachian truths, legends, and long-forgotten secrets. I'll keep telling, if you keep listening. Stay out of the hollow, and don't answer when the humming starts.